counselor. And so I really welcome discussion and feedback as we go along. If we start to go too far afield, I'll probably ask just that we hold things to the end. But I do really like to participate in workshops, so feel free to raise your hand as we go. So again, my name is Jennifer Lucas Brown. I'm a licensed professional counselor and an AASECT certified sex therapist. Before we start, I thought I would just give you a little bit about my background and how I got into sex therapy. So I grew up in a very conservative Protestant Christian home. I have very loving parents, but they were not at all comfortable talking about sex or sexuality. I see nodding heads. And so I got the talk when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, which is very cursory and left me with a lot more questions than answers. And then as I got older, the primary message I got was sex before marriage is bad. That's essentially it. That was the sum total of my sex education. And so, what I really learned from that and what I took from that was one, that wasn't okay to ask questions about sex or sexuality. I also learned to experience a lot of shame when it came to my thoughts, feelings, behaviors around sexuality. And so when I was in my 20s, I actually spent a good deal of time both in therapy as well as just in my own studies trying to figure out, like, what do I think about sexuality? How do I kind of come to be at peace with my own sexuality? And so then when I started working, I was working for a nonprofit organization that did educational programs for girls, and I eventually became their sex educator. And I loved it. I loved talking to girls ages 6 to 18 about sex and sexuality and the bodies. And then when I decided to become a therapist, I knew I wanted to work with couples, and so it was really a no-brainer for me to get certified in sex therapy. So I love what I do. I'm very passionate about it. I love talking to other people about what I do. And I put this quote up here. So we could spend a lot of time just talking about this quote. Has everyone had a chance to at least kind of glance over it? I'm saying mostly nods. I put it up here primarily today because I wanted us to start really thinking about sex and sexuality as something beyond function and performance, and about sexuality is a part of who we are as human beings from the moment we're born until the moment we die. And so although I know that most of you probably don't specialize in sex therapy, there's a good chance that you may not specialize in sex therapy, issues of sexuality probably walk into your office just about every day. And the thing is that unless we ask about those issues, a lot of times people won't tell you about them. Or they'll tell you about them after you've been seeing them for a while and they're on their way out and say, oh yeah, by the way, I've never mentioned X, Y, and Z. And so what we take from that is that we live very much in, generally speaking, in a sex-negative culture. And so there is a ton of shame around issues of sexuality, especially for people to come talk about it themselves. The more that we can ask them about sexuality and give them the permission to talk about it, the better. As one sex therapist has said, when it comes to issues of sexuality, especially in the therapy room, all roads lead to shame. So, yes. So we need to be able to give the space for people to talk about this. So what is it that we're doing here today? So what I hope for us to get out of today is that we'll explore what is unhealthy sexuality, what is healthy sexuality. We'll help increase knowledge of the implicit model of sex therapy. Become more comfortable with using at least 2 sex therapy interventions, and increase knowledge about when it is that you should refer out to a sex therapist. So trust, to body image, to our sexual functioning, to our gender identity, who we're attracted to, and how we express sexual intimacy with a partner or partners. If I'm talking about a specific sexual behavior, I'll try to be explicit about that, but if I'm not, please feel free to ask me to clarify what it is that I'm talking about. And finally, I also want to just take a moment to talk about comfort and safety in here. So I like to do participatory workshops, but please know that everything is always challenged by choice. So if you want to take a break, go to the bathroom, or just observe, feel free to do that. I also know that in a group of this size, there's probably a significant number of people who've experienced some kind of sexual trauma or unwanted sexual behavior. So I want to make sure that we're all just taking care of ourselves today. Feel free again to take a break whenever you need to. So any questions or concerns before we get started? Okay, so I want to start by having you get into groups of 2 or 3 and talk about these questions. So how did you learn about sexuality growing up? How did you learn about sex therapy or sexuality in your training or grad school? And then what are your biggest concerns or questions regarding sexuality in your own work with clients? So let's turn to, like I said, two other people around you. To you.
I turned it off. Do you want it back on?
Well, let's try it. It seems like the acoustics aren't great. Hello?
Yep.
Can you hear me better? If you start to not be able to hear me, just go raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, and then you can tell me. Okay, so I just want to hear from a few people. Like, what were some of the things you talked about for how you all learned about sexuality growing up?
In school.
In school, okay. And what would be kind of covered at school?
Just basic anatomy and just how
Kind of basic puberty stuff, and, okay. Yeah.
And I think it depends on the generation, because in my day, we didn't have sex education in school.
Okay, not at all.
And so if you weren't the bad kids, you could hear about it, but if you were a goody-goody like me, never mind.
I went to a sex ed class in middle school, and we, put condoms on bananas, and we got a baby doll that we had to take home for 3 days that you had put a key in to feed it, and you change its diaper, and it knew if you flipped it upside down, or it was a very extensive class on STIs and contraceptives, and yeah.
Did you talk at all about things like values, pleasure?
They definitely did not want to talk about pleasure. But then I do remember them talking about what would be your decision, what are your values around it, your morals. But no pleasure.
No pleasure. Okay. Yep.
My mom took me to a hotel for a weekend, having a girls' weekend, and we listened to cassette tapes about sex and masturbation, and with just me and my mom and this man speaking on a cassette tape. It was awful. She tried.
I think there were a lot of mixed messages from media, from sex education, which was purely biological, had nothing to do with relationship, had nothing to do with developing who you were as a sexual being. So, a big disconnect in our culture.
Right. And you bring up a really good point. A lot of our sex education is actually informal, right? It's like we might get some of the biology, if you've got a more extensive one, they might talk about some values and decision making. Excuse me, but a lot of what we learn is from our peers, is from movies, from songs. Nowadays, a lot of what is learned is from porn, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So yeah, it is disjointed. There's not, even just listening to all of you. I mean, what a wide range of how you learned about sexuality, and not a lot on those.
I grew up with an older sister. And she had a lot of dolls, female dolls that weren't anatomically correct.
Right.
And the first time I walked in with my sister taking a bath and looked at her, I went and got her dolls and she looked at them and I said, something's wrong here.
fairly positive experience, and you just talked about, I think a lot depends on how comfortable, at least a portion of your family, your parents, how comfortable they were when talking about it.
Absolutely. That's a really important point.
Although I don't remember if they talked about legislation, now that I think about it.
Yeah, well, and, we can grow up, there's actually typology of different kinds of environments we grow up in, and I'm not going to remember all of the types. If you're interested, there's a great book called Sex Smart that talks about family, how the family we grew up in impacts our growing sexuality. And it's really very insightful and helpful. It's a great tool actually for clients, because at the end of every chapter there are exercises that they can do. But they talk about, we can grow up in actually sex-negative environments, where it's, sex is shameful, sex is not something you talk about, you can get in trouble for it. You can grow up in kind of a neutral environment where it's just not really talked about, like this void that's not talked about at all. You can grow up in, ideally, a positive environment where it's okay to ask questions, to talk about, your parents help you explore values, decision-making, all of that. And then there's, on the other extreme, there's the overly permissive, where it's, overly sexualized environment. That's not healthy for kids growing up either. So it can be helpful, too, to have clients think about what kind of environment did they grow up in? How did that impact their sexuality? How comfortable they are talking about their sexuality, exploring their own sexuality, especially talking with a partner about their sexuality. So what about, just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip 2 for right now, but what are some of your biggest concerns or questions in your own practice or work around talking about sexuality? I'm going to write some of these down so that we can get to them. Yeah.
Well, I think typically the woman will bring it up.
Okay.
And then the man's embarrassed and he doesn't want to talk about it because it's usually something about performance. And if the man brings it up, it's because he doesn't get any.
Right.
And then she's embarrassed. So
Yeah.
both have, if there's one that's comfortable talking about, the other one doesn't seem to be as comfortable.
Absolutely.
I guess if anything, it sort of relates to my answer to number 2, is that the training was very isolated. Like the sex was like human sexuality, if talked about at all, was sort of isolated in its own class, and it was about problems and function. Not a lot to talk about pleasure or development or healthy sexual practices, and so how to integrate it into a holistic kind of overview or looking at something.
I think my concern is, well, there's a trench off the Puerto Rican coast where it drops down from about 100 feet offshore to 28,000 feet. And I think of a EAP counselor seeing people 3 to 5 visits, getting one of these in their office, and very quickly you're at 28,000 feet and you need to refer someone out instead of trying to do something with them.
Sure. When you have them in 3 to 5 sessions.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. What else?
So mine's different. I work with older people, so there's a lot of issues coming up with assisted living communities. So caregivers walking in on people who live in an assisted living community, having sex because they're checking on them, or a spouse in an Alzheimer's ward who's married but who's interested in somebody else, and the spouse is outside the community, or people in nursing homes not having a place to have sex. So communities are starting to write up sex agreements in their contracts, and nursing homes are starting to, like, I don't want to say make sex rooms, but they have to provide a place for people to have sex. But then it's like, well, anybody walking by is like, well, if anybody's in there, we know what they're doing. You know, so there's this whole thing.
Right.
Yeah. How do you manage sex in communities?
Yeah, well, I've seen over the past several years is, with the internet, addiction to pornography.
Okay.
Do a lot of, not a lot, probably about 5 clients on that. It's so accessible.
Right.
Now they can even do it on the phones. So it's just, it's probably, to break that cycle, you can't tell them to stay off the computer because they're probably using it at home or doing it at work. You know, and I know a lot of workplaces have blocked certain parts of the internet because of that.
Right.
But, you know, just trying to get in there with a good therapist, you know, to break that cycle.
In relation to what Jim was saying, I think there's, in the workplace, there's a lot of management level people who sometimes refer people because of being on the computer for certain things. And the thing I've heard from several over the years was, but he's a good Christian guy. He's a deacon in the church. How can he be doing that? And it's this whole misconception that you have to be kind of sleazy to be doing that when you've got a lot of people who are very upset with you.
In fact, that is often, I mean, like with any kind, and we can get into a whole discussion about how sex therapists see out of control sexual behavior versus sex addiction, and I'm not going to go there, but we could do that. But the point is looking at out of control sexual behavior or problematic sexual behavior as something that oftentimes is like any kind of other problematic behavior, whether that's drugs, alcohol, and gambling, whatever, is often an escape from something. They're trying to get away from what else is going on with them, what else is bothering them. And so getting into what are the triggers, the specific triggers for them is really, really important. And there's the immediate triggers, like what's the trigger before they start the behavior. And then there's also the deeper triggers. What is it that is leading to them looking for that kind of escape or outlet as well? Yep.
Tacking on to that, that conversation I found can happen only when the client agrees that the behavior is a problem. And a lot of times I've ended up with a couple where the person doing the behavior does not think that it's problematic and may even think that it's healthy because of their background, et cetera, but their partner disagrees. So that's a
really good point.
Really difficult place to navigate and to try to get somebody to see that, okay, if it's a problem for your partner, doesn't that make it a problem for you? And that whole thing.
So, generally speaking, like wanting to take a sex positive approach, I won't necessarily think that pornography use in and of itself is problematic. If it is a problem for the partner, then it's a discussion, it's a exploration of what is it, how is it getting in the way of their connection together, how is it getting in the way of their communication or their own sexual intimacy, what is it that's happening that is making it a problem within the relationship. And a lot of times it's not necessarily the and you know, it depends. It's like, is the partner going on chat sites and contacting other live people and having, you know, online sex essentially, or are they going on Ashley Madison and starting up these, you know, emotional affairs and then they go meet people? That's something different than occasionally watching porn to masturbating. So doing a lot of assessment is really important. Also, it's like, what kind of, if it is porn, what kind of porn are they watching? Is this like a fantasy thing they feel like they can't bring to their partner, let their shame around that? And so this is their outlet. In which case, some of it might be helping to mitigate that shame, helping them to be able to share some of these fantasies with their partner and integrate it into their sexual intimacy together. So there's lots of different ways that, you know, we can approach this without necessarily saying, you know, some certain behavior is bad, or siding with, you know, the one partner to say like, well, this is definitely a problem in your relationship. I think we need to be careful about that for no other reason than they will not show up in your office again because they feel like they're just being attacked. Yeah.
One that I've struggled with along those lines with clients that have shown up in my office have been when there's sort of extremes of value differences around pornography use. You know, I've had clients where, you know, just from an objective standpoint, if the person were a single person and there wasn't somebody else in their life that had a problem, I wouldn't necessarily look at it and say, wow, that's really out of control, like you're not going to work because you're too busy looking at porn. You know, like there would be no other consequences for their use. It seems pretty moderate. It seems, you know, otherwise not problematic, except their partner is looking at this and saying, well, that's not okay with me because A, that's exploitative to the people in the pornography, and B, you are electronically going outside of our marriage to get your needs met. And that one where the partner that's, you know, using the pornography is like, look, this is harmless, this is, it's not like I'm hooking up with a real person, it's not even interactive, I'm just looking at some pictures or videos, and it's not that often. And I mean, I've fallen back on more just sort of basic couples counseling skills of, hey, let's have a conflict discussion about this, and let's, you know, use some of those skills to help them try to sort through it themselves. But that's been a really challenging one for me, where it's just those extreme value differences around it, and it's not a clear, yeah, wow, your behavior's out of control and you're just in denial, or like.
And I would agree with you that like falling back, so to speak, on kind of general couples counseling is important, is probably indicated in those kind of situations. I think helping them to explore what are their fears and their worries that are coming up. You know, for the partner that is like, I really don't like you going to something electronic outside the relationship. Well, what is that fear that's coming up? What is it telling them then that their partner, how their partner thinks about them or thinks about their relationship? Is it telling them that like they can't live up to, you know, these images that they're seeing, that there's these expectations that they're supposed to be all shaved and smooth and big-breasted and all of this stuff, and the partner won't be attracted to them. So helping them to have some of that deeper conversation of what is it that it's triggering for you, for both partners too. So, and when your partner says, hey, I really don't like this, and you say, well, tough luck, I want to do it anyway. Well, what's that about? You know, so what's going on for you that you're saying, like, it doesn't matter to me that my partner doesn't like this, or that they think it's hurting the relationship. So I would agree. I think going back into couples counseling in those kind of situations and helping them get down deeper into what's happening is really important. That makes sense? Okay. And I was going to say this at the very beginning. Out of control sexual behavior, sex addiction, whatever term we want to use, is a huge topic. So while I know that that's probably a lot of what you see, and I'm happy to have some discussion about it, just also know that's not the focus of this presentation, because that would be a whole separate deal. So we'll just kind of see how we go. We might need to move some of those questions to the end too. So any other big concerns that were coming up for any of you as you thought about seeing clients?
Let me put one thing out, I'll probably get screwed up with some of the women, but I truly believe that there's some gender differences there.
Okay.
Whereas men very often see sex as sex. Women quite often have intimacy, a whole lot of other stuff to it that men sometimes don't.
Right.
And I think that's an issue you brought up.
Right.
You know, what's it mean to me? What's it mean to you? Two different things.
Absolutely. And I think what I tack on with that, and I think that you're right, I think generally speaking that's often the case. You know, what's the saying, like, men have sex to feel connected, women need to feel connected to have sex. And that is oftentimes the case. Is that an innate thing? Is that the way that men and women are socialized very differently? I think that oftentimes, you know, men are more socialized growing up, very generally speaking, to divorce kind of feelings from what they do with their bodies. Women are much more socialized to be connection or relationship driven. And so I don't necessarily like to kind of say, oh, well, this is just that, you know, this is a man and woman difference. Although that is often the case. But again, helping them explore, well, if you as a man are having a lot of sexual experiences that are kind of cut off from your emotional experience, how is that impacting your relationships? And that can be important to explore. If you are, you know, for some women, they feel so divorced from their own bodies that it's like they don't even think about sexual intimacy as a way of also building connection. And so helping them explore, like, what is it that's getting in the way of experiencing touch, sexual intimacy as something that also builds your emotional connection with your partner? So it's, again, kind of taking it from both ends and helping them to explore that some more. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's move on a little bit. What are you doing? sexuality is just kind of a good place to start, because it has to do too with our own values around sex and sexuality. So I want to have a discussion, and we like to throw around the words healthy and unhealthy a lot, but what exactly do those mean? And so I want to do a group brainstorm about what are the ways that you define, first we'll do unhealthy. How would you define, or ways that you would describe unhealthy sexuality?
Coercive.
I'm a terrible speller, so forgive me.
Abusive.
Abusive, demeaning, is that what you said? Okay.
Not mutually satisfied.
Shame.
Shameful. Okay.
Conditional.
Can you say a little more about that?
If you don't have sex with me,
Mm.
it means you don't love me.
Got it.
Or I won't love you if you don't.
Like manipulative.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think along with that, like obligatory.
Sure. I get that a lot with couples. Oh God, it's been 3 weeks since we had sex, so I guess we have to have sex.
It's your duty. It's your duty.
Right. Which, I always tell couples, that is a #1 desire killer.
Submit to me.
Right.
I'm the man.
What else? So I have a question. Who gets to decide whether it's abusive, demeaning, shameful, conditional? Who's deciding that?
Either.
Say
Either.
either, okay?
Everyone involved.
Yeah. Right. I would say if one person
Right.
feels any of those things, then it's just not healthy.
So it's, the partners are deciding if this is what is going on.
Mutual consent.
So I'm going to put that over here on healthy. Because there may be relationships, especially for couples or for partners who are interested in, say, the BDSM community, where from the outside, it might look abusive, it might look demeaning, but they are consensual acts that they're engaging in. It's for their own mutual pleasure and satisfaction. So it's important to remember who it is that gets to define some of this. So what would you put under healthy?
Increases interest.
Okay. What if you just want to have a one-night stand?
They both want it.
Is there kind of a space for that? Like, assuming that neither of them have partners who would not consent to that? Okay.
Like ideally, both partners would be aware that that's what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
So that it's not exploitative.
Right. Very important.
Safety.
Going back to this consent piece, right?
Safety.
Safety. How would you define that? What would be included in safety?
Again, both people have the space to initiate, reject, participate, communicate.
Participate. Okay.
Needs are met.
Okay. Mutual needs,
Yeah, mutual.
right? It's not just one person getting off and, okay.
Pleasurable.
Oh, good, someone said it.
What is that? You didn't get that in school.
Sure.
Experiments.
Sure.
You say this, oh God.
And for many people, that is the experience. Now, does that mean that every sexual experience has to be a spiritual that we prescribe to sexuality can be under spiritual. It's really important.
I don't know how to say it, but kind of the spiritual thing is you don't set the bar too high.
Realistic expectations. That is actually really, really important. I'll talk a little bit later about some of those.
Trust and respect.
Trust and respect. And so again, like looking at some of these might be more appropriate to within a committed relationship. You're going to have a different kind of trust and respect with the partner that you've been with than you will with maybe someone who you're going to have a casual sexual encounter with. But still being able to have some kind of level of trust.
I think honesty,
Okay.
especially in the
Really, absolutely. And honesty is connected to things like consent, to being non-manipulative or non-exploitative, right? Okay. So again, who is it that gets to decide? Healthy and what's unhealthy? You as the participant, because I will guarantee you will have clients that will come into the room and they'll say, I think this about our sex life. I think this about our sex life, and then they look at you. You are the arbiter. You get to decide what is healthy and unhealthy. We are coming to you to settle this disagreement for us. And being able to step back and say, like, here's what I believe is encompassed in healthy sexuality. But what that means for you as a couple and how you're going to define your sexuality is something that we'll have to explore and discuss. So generally speaking, when I'm working with couples, I'll say that healthy sexuality is consensual, it's safe, meaning that there's no lasting bodily or emotional harm, honest, non-exploitative, and mutually pleasurable. Within that, there's a huge range of how partners may express their sexuality.
I think our culture is often damaging about the idea of what healthy sex is. But I can remember a client coming into my office and saying, my mother thinks that what's going on in my marriage isn't healthy. And I remember at that time sitting there going, well, what's your mother got to say about this? And given everything that we're exposed to through the media these days about what, as Rachel was alluding to, what a great sex life is, I'm not quite sure anybody can attain that great sex life on an ongoing basis every day.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, we get these mixed messages. On the one hand, we can have these very strict guidelines. In some segments of our society, it's like any sex that's outside of a long-term committed relationship, heterosexual, is going to be unhealthy. And then you have this whole other segment that's saying like, well, every sexual encounter should be fun and exciting and acrobatic and all of these things. So yeah, what are people supposed to do? How are people supposed to figure out what is healthy for them? There is actually a great video that's out on the internet right now that I recommend watching. It's called The Realistic Hollywood Sex Scene. Just Google that and she's not. And it is hysterical. But it's a great thing to normalize. Like, what a real sexual encounter. It's a straight couple. And it starts off with, they're young, they're hard-bodied. It kind of starts off as like your typical Hollywood sex scene, pushing her up against a wall. It's all very passionate. But very quickly it starts things like, he slips out, she gets a leg cramp, someone farts, like, all this stuff, saying like, are you finished? No, not quite. And you don't see anything, like it's all kind of from the neck up. It's just talked about, so it's not, real graphic or anything. But it's a great reminder of like what real sex, which real couples actually looks like, talking about real things. Okay. So let's talk about the Plicit model for a second. Oh yeah.
Can I just interrupt with a quick thought based on your recommendation for this video? There's also a group that has developed healthy porn, where they actually have a site of real people engaging in sex, including porn stars, but porn stars doing the real thing instead of the on-screen thing, which of course I can't remember, but it's out there.
Okay.
I had a question too before we go on. It seems like we're talking about sex and sexuality as if they're the same thing. And I think of them as differently. Sex is a part of sexuality. So.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. No, and thank you for bringing that up. And certainly while we're talking about healthy and unhealthy sexuality, we're talking more about kind of the sexual acts and behaviors, thoughts and feelings with the sexual acts. But absolutely, especially issues like body image are huge for both men and women. And that is a part of sexuality that we often don't delve into, but can have huge repercussions, not only for how people express their sexual intimacies with a partner, but also just how they feel in the world, how they express themselves, the confidence they feel. So that's another piece of our sexuality that I think is often overlooked.
Can you differentiate between sensual and sexual?
Good. Sensual can also be sexual, but doesn't have to be. And sensual has more to do usually with touch specifically. So like with babies, for example, we may touch them very sensually. A massage can be very sensual, but it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. Does that make sense? So sensuality has more to do with how we experience ourselves, our bodies, I should say, as well as the bodies of a significant other. How we experience touch, whether that's something that's connected to love and intimacy, or whether touch is connected to, say, other things like violence or abuse.
Would you say that men sometimes mistake a woman's sensuality for being sexual?
Absolutely. And I think that oftentimes sensuality is jumped over for just moving to sexuality, or just moving to sex, I should say, in a very narrow, defined way. And generally speaking, and again, how much of this has to do with how boys and girls are raised and how they're touched growing up. There's certainly been plenty of studies that show that from the age of 3 months, we touch little baby boys differently than we touch girls. Boys were much rougher. We do a lot more throwing up in the air, kind of rough touch. With girls, we do a lot more cuddling, a lot more stroking. And so is this a matter of like there's really a sex or gender difference, or is this how we learn to associate touch with things like love and comfort and intimacy? I also think that if we grow up, say, in a family that's abusive or that's violent, we learn to associate touch with abuse and violence. That doesn't mean that we're stuck there. These things are fluid and malleable. And so we can work with people to help them relearn touch. Wendy Maltz, M-A-L-T-Z, is a sex therapist who has some great videos and tapes about relearning touch, especially if you have grown up in a violent kind of situation. Is that? All right. So, is anyone or everyone familiar with the Twisted model? So the Twisted model was developed in 1974 by Jack Cannon specifically for sex therapy. It is meant to be progressive, so you start at P and you move on to the IT. It stands for permission, limited information, specific suggestions, and intensive therapy. Now, why limited information? Because if not, it would be the PISSIT model, and that just doesn't sound good. So they made it limited information. I'm going to go into more detail about the first two, permission and limited information. So let me just say a couple of words about the latter two. Specific suggestion, let me back up for a second. It was originally thought, like when Jack Cannon created this, he felt like most issues of sexuality or sex that people brought into therapy could be addressed with the first three strategies. And that only in kind of extreme cases would people actually need intensive therapy. You talk to just about any sex therapist today and they would say, nope, we pretty much have to do therapy with everyone. And there could be a lot of different reasons for that. I think some of it is that because of the internet, there is a lot more just information out there. Because of drugs like Viagra, Cialis, people are kind of going to other avenues first. They only come into therapy when it's like they really can't figure something out. Specific suggestions have to do with specific interventions the sex therapist might suggest for clients. So if someone comes in, for example, with feeling kind of divorced from their own body or not really just knowing their body, they might suggest some exercises around self-awareness of their body, which might include examining their genitals in the mirror, at-home masturbation exercises, basically to increase their self-awareness. The intensive therapy I just talked about, and certainly sometimes the sex therapy is specific to the sexual issue, but sometimes there's other underlying issues like OCD or other anxiety problems, depression. So there can be a lot of things that might be included in that therapy. So, as I mentioned before, when it comes to sex therapy, when it comes to sexual issues that come up in therapy, oftentimes those lead to shame. So, for that reason, permission giving becomes foundational to what it is that we're doing with clients. And on the very basic level, permission is simply providing the space for them to talk about sexuality. But permission is also gives clients permission that the thoughts, feelings, desires, and behaviors that enhance their satisfaction and do not have negative consequences for others are normal. It gives them permission to individuals and couples to appreciate their own unique desires and patterns without having to compare themselves to others. And that's a really big thing. Someone told me recently, which I just love, it's a quote, and I don't know who the original quote is from, but it says, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And I think that happens a lot when it comes to sex and sexuality. Body image is a huge but it has to do too with those realistic expectations. Who are you comparing yourself to? And what does that do to your own joy and your own experiences? So permission is also about giving people permission to not engage in activities and behaviors that they don't want to, they don't want to consent to. So permission is all about normalizing, validating, and countering shame. Now, one of the things that because we tend to live in a sex-negative culture, sometimes people will come in very distressed, and it has to do with internalized shame that has come up. And so sometimes instead of just kind of taking their distress at face value, we need to explore where is this distress coming from, and is it coming from internalized societal shame? So there was something that came up on the ASEC listserv recently. Did everyone know what ASEC is? Okay, so it's the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And they're pretty much the certifying body for us sex therapists. And so on the listserv, someone brought up that there was a client, straight male client who was coming in very distressed about what he described as a fetish for women's legs. And so certainly there's all sorts of things that need to be assessed around that, not the least of which is, how is he defining fetish? Can you diagnose him that way? But some of the ways that we might explore some of the internalized shame that might be coming out is asking questions like, what about your desire or your arousal by women's legs bothers you? Does this excitement for women's legs get in the way of you experiencing an emotional or sexual connection with a woman that you're interested in? Has your arousal or excitement for women's legs ever impelled you to do something that afterwards made you feel anxious or even ashamed? And then how is it that you think that therapy can help you with this issue? And how do you expect that to make you feel happier? And so these kinds of questions can help start exploring, where are these messages coming for him? Certainly a lot of sex therapists on the list were saying, so women's legs are now a fetish? How did that happen? Aren't a lot of people turned on by women's legs? It seems like a fairly common issue. So needing to explore, is this something that leads to offending behaviors, for example, or is this just something, is it an exclusive issue, like he needs to see certain kind of women's legs in order to get turned on at all? Or does he just really like women's legs? And so helping him tease all of that out, and whether this is really an issue or just something that he's feeling kind of that internalized shame. Does that make sense? All right. So the limited information is really about psychoeducation, factually based sexuality education. Okay, we took our clothes off, I got on top of you, how long till it starts feeling good? I don't know, but I've got a headache already. So there's a lot of great information out there on the internet, there's also a lot of really bad information or misleading information. So sometimes clients come in just not really knowing some basic information about sex or sexuality or what to expect. Regardless of whether we think that there's a healthy space for pornography within an individual or couple's life, we can probably all agree that pornography is a terrible tool for sex education. And unfortunately, especially with the younger generation, that is becoming their primary sex education tool. There's a sex researcher and therapist, Paul Joannides. If you've ever seen the book, The Guide to Getting It On, that's his book. It's an excellent resource, by the way. And he has said, trying to learn how to have sex by watching porn is just like trying to learn how to drive by watching The Fast and the Furious. So helping people understand their own bodies, what is in the range of kind of normal expectations. For example, I will often have couples come in, and this is always kind of really surprising to me. Straight couples come in really distressed by the fact that the female partner is not having an orgasm when they have sex. And just telling them that the vast majority of women, over 70%, some people actually say that probably no women, orgasm with vaginal intercourse alone. And they're like, oh, really? Because every movie you see tells you that not only do you orgasm through vaginal intercourse alone, but it happens at the same time. Which is another thing. I really want to be able to come together. It's like, okay, well, what's important to you about that? Is it just that you think that that's supposed to be kind of the pinnacle of experience? Right? Maybe that's part of that spiritual experience for you. What does it mean to you then if that's something that's really not common? That's not an easy thing. And to do that, I mean, imagine, it's like to really have two people come at the same time. You're having this conversation. Are you close? Yeah, I'm kind of close. Are you? Okay. Ah! So normalizing some of that can be very helpful for people. Or especially normalizing what are some of the expected changes to sexual functioning, to your bodies, especially as you get older. Having some of that information can be very helpful. I've had men especially come in who are 70 plus years old and really distressed that they are not able to get a firm hard erection the way they were when they were 35, 30. And having them just doing some basic education about changes to their body. Also, one other thing, if you are working with adolescents or college-age students or probably anyone in their 20s, a great resource is a YouTube channel by Lacey Green, L-A-C-I, last name Green, just like the color. She has a huge number of very short videos, most of them are only a few minutes long, on specific sexual questions. So everything from masturbation to how to understand that you don't need to clean your vagina, that is a self-cleaning part of your body, to anal sex. I mean, she has something and it's really great, accurate information. She works, I believe, with Planned Parenthood, she partners with them. So she's very clear to have good factual information. All right, so So let's talk about a couple of interventions that you might use. So this is a great intervention, especially if you're working with a couple who have a significant desire discrepancy. And this is the word that we like to use rather than someone coming in with a problem with low desire. Because automatically when you say, okay, this is a low desire disorder that is IPing one part of the couple, and saying, well, low compared to who? Compared to your partner? Compared to some random standard out there? It's much more accurate to say that there's a desire discrepancy that's causing the stress within the relationship. So there's two primary purposes to this intervention. The first one is really just helping couples to increase their sexual communication. A lot of couples don't talk about how they experience sex or their sexual intimacy together. Or the conversation doesn't really go beyond, I want more sex, I don't want it right now. And that's kind of where it stays. So that's one purpose of the intervention. Another purpose is to help people start seeing their own role and responsibility in their own desire. So that they're not just looking at their partner and saying, well, if you did this, or if you stopped doing that, or if you looked this way, then I would have more desire. So the way, this is a very simple intervention. I usually have them start this, we'll do this in session, but then I may have them continue it at home as an at-home exercise, where they take turns facing each other and going back and forth to say, I turn myself off by, and then they'll do that like 2 or 3 times, back and forth, and then I'll say, okay, what are ways that you turn yourself on? Turn myself on by. So we are actually going to do this. Don't panic. You don't have to share things you feel comfortable with. So certainly, while some couples may talk about like they get turned on by specific sexual fantasies or ways that they touch themselves, there's lots of ways we turn ourselves on and off that aren't specifically sexual. So for example, I turn myself off by thinking about all the housework that has to get done. Right? I turn myself off by being critical about my own body. I turn myself on by giving myself a few moments to myself after putting the kids to bed. I turn myself on by eating healthy and taking care of my body. So what I want you to do is turn to one other person sitting next to you and just practice this. Go back and forth, come up with at least one for each. Remember, this is challenge by choice. So whatever you feel comfortable sharing, and if you don't feel comfortable sharing anything, that's fine too. But I just want you to get practice on what this might feel like for your couples or for your clients to come up with what are their own responsibilities around their desires.
Well, Okay.
So what was that like for you? Start thinking about what are those things that turn yourself on or turn yourself off?
Al, and I feel good.
You need to turn yourself off.
Yeah.
Like being in your head, you know, of like things you have to do, or like just, you know, oh, I look like this, or you didn't shake my legs, or, you know, things, you know, different
Right.
ways, yeah.
Right. Well, look at all these body image things that are, right? Just look a certain way, just, you shave a certain way. There's actually another great video. On YouTube again called The Honest R&B Song. It's hysterical.
What's it called?
The Honest R&B Song. And there's a line in there, and it's by a male artist. And there's a line in there where he talks about like, you know, I want to get it on tonight, essentially, but do you mind if I leave my shirt on? Because I have that big finger at Boston Market.
What was the first film you mentioned?
The realistic Hollywood sex scene. So, right, ways you turn yourself off, eating too much, feeling maybe bloated or too full, or I'm supposed to have, oh, I didn't shave my legs today. What else? Just what was it like for you even coming up with or thinking about, like, what are ways that you turn yourself on? What are ways that you turn yourself off?
I feel like it could be a really helpful intervention because it's very easy to get into what I turn myself off by, right? And then, so it seems like a really approachable way to dive into the subject.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was really struck by the language because I think most of us, most couples, we talk about you turn me off,
Right.
or you turn me on. And we
Exactly.
always are looking at that coming together. So
Yep.
this language is challenging.
Yep. And
It's
that's
my
one of the main
responsibility.
purposes, right, of this intervention is moving from the you, the external processing to that internal processing. You know, how am I responsible? How do I impact sexuality or sexual desire in this case?
Well, and for women, I think that's very empowering too, that thing about, I mean, it is, I take ownership, but that I have something, it's not something done to me. Hey, I'm actually a partner with this, and I do this. I take it on. So that staying, Deb and I talked a lot about that, being present in the moment. Because if you're thinking about what just happened or how, you know, what you said yesterday, and I'm still pissed about that, and it's really hard to get into the moment, but I'm still pissed that you didn't take the garbage out like you said you were going to.
Absolutely.
But 7 years ago, I said that.
Literally garbage back
That
out.
one time, right, that was my favorite. But you said back in 1989. Going along with that, it'd be very empowering because if you have a straight couple, especially, it can be very empowering for the female client to think about how they're turning themselves on or off. But it also can be very normalizing and relieving for their male partner because oftentimes they come with the preconceived notion of like, I'm doing something wrong. I'm not turning you on enough. I can't get it right, which can be very shameful. And lead to a lot of just anger and defensiveness. And so this opens up some space for them to start to, oh, wait, so there's ways that you impact your desire too. It's not just that I'm really screwing this up, or you're not attracted to me, or I don't know what I'm doing in the bedroom. So that can be really helpful too. Now, it may be the case that they also need to work on how they, both partners are working in the bedroom, but that's a separate discussion.
I think it's also put some personal accountability back on the male partner too. I see a lot of male partners who, again, sort of project that responsibility to manage it onto the partner. You know, you're not doing enough for me, versus how are you taking responsibility for your own needs and actions.
Absolutely. Or a lot of what I see too is like, well, what's your problem that you don't want sex? You know, and sometimes it's like, well, the sex isn't very good, so why should I want it?
It's that cheese dip on your lap.
But sometimes it's, you know, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of pressure, and yeah, sometimes I don't want to have sex when I have these lunches I have to make for the kids, and I might see, or if any, that you would kind of get stuck with this intervention, or your clients might get stuck?
We talked a little bit about how you can use this to deal with clients, how comfortable they feel, and like helping them with the progression of it, like starting off with some of those more mild pieces of when I don't feel good about myself, and helping them progress into more sexual behaviors. And that may be for some clients who haven't ever talked about it, hard to communicate, and helping them find those words and naming things more openly with each other.
Absolutely.
So.
And often the way I do this is I don't have them do a whole lot of discussion about it. And so they'll turn and face each other, and when we're doing like how I turn myself off, I just have them take turns going back and forth, back and forth. So we don't do a lot of discussion and get sidetracked. But when you do that, they do tend to get deeper relatively quickly. I have them do at least 3, 4, 5 times in each of them, back and forth, before we move on. And then we'll kind of have them discuss afterwards. But that gives them a little bit of space and time to really start digging into some of that stuff. And they do. They kind of start with the more non-sexual things and move into more personal or vulnerable spaces. I also really normalize a lot of this stuff for couples right off the bat by saying things like, it does not get more vulnerable than talking about when you're naked together. So, of course, I appreciate the fact that you are willing to talk about this and be a stranger, that you're willing to even discuss some of these things. Of course, it's going to feel awkward. I invite you to tell me if it feels really uncomfortable. And that really helps, again, just to give permission and say, like, yeah, this isn't easy to talk about. And it is really vulnerable. It also gives them that permission to go into those more vulnerable spaces where it's not, again, it's not just about function, but it's about when you say no to me, I'm afraid that you don't love me anymore. Or that I'm not adequate as a lover. I'm not good enough for you. Those are really vulnerable spaces to go into. Okay, I'm going to move on. So this is my all-time go-to intervention. I use this with probably every single sex therapy client that I have. And this can be used in a variety of ways. So essentially, I put up here, it's good for issues around desire, it's good for performance anxiety, and just general sexual well-being overall. This can be used as pleasure versus performance. This can be used just as a psychoeducational tool to help them start having a discussion about how they think about their own sexuality and their sexual intimacy. It can help to increase sexual communication between couples. And then also I will use this as a basis or a foundation for giving them at-home sensual or sexual exercises. That will do. So, essentially, there is a very big difference if you put the focus on performance versus if you put the focus on pleasure. When we're talking about whether we're talking about sexuality in general or about sexual intimacy and behavior specifically. So if we put the focus on performance, we get very quickly into, we're talking about sex as an activity. We're talking about sex as behaviors, not about a general intimacy or identity. So we're talking about function now. Is the erection hard? Is there lubrication? Do we know what goes where? We're talking about function. Very quickly, intercourse and or orgasm becomes the goal. So anytime that we're going to be sexual together, it's going to have to lead to intercourse or orgasm. Performance is our focus. That's where it's headed. It's like one-track mind. And oftentimes when that's the case, when performance is the goal, then what happens is it creates feelings of pressure and anxiety. So whether that's in a desire discrepancy situation where the person with the lower desire feels this tremendous pressure that any kind of touch is going to have to lead to intercourse or orgasm. Or anxiety of, okay, if we're going am I doing this right? Is my erection hard enough? Am I able to give him or her an orgasm? It sets up his performance anxiety, which can, of course, lead to things like dysfunction, lowered sexual desire. There's nothing that kills desire faster than pressure and anxiety. I often tell my clients our brain is our largest sex organ. So if things are going along and you're responding sexually, but you suddenly start getting anxious about how is this going to go? Am I doing this right? Am I going to be able to perform? That's going to lower both your desire and your arousal. Can also lead to dysfunction such as erectile dysfunction. I see this a lot. Rarely do, and I always send if people come in with ED, usually they've already talked to the doctor about it. If they haven't, I send them to a urologist just to rule out medical issues. But oftentimes it's performance anxiety that's coming up. They start thinking about, they're starting to be sexual with their partner, they're getting excited, but then they start thinking about, oh God, am I going to be able to keep my erection this time? Oh no, there it goes, and then they're in their head, right? Like, of course you're going to lose your erection because you're up here spinning and really anxious. So that's what happens when we put the focus on performance. And that is, I mean, everything from how we learn about sex, when we learn about sex as function, as like a biologically based, this is reproduction, which is typical for, I think, even in the more advanced or progressive sex education that we have nowadays. Still, the focus tends to be on reproduction, how your body works, what's the function of it. Instead, if we focus on pleasure, it totally changes the paradigm. So first of all, when we're talking about pleasure, we're talking about mutual pleasure. So this is about both people experiencing pleasure. When we're talking about pleasure, that doesn't necessarily be pleasure with our partner or with ourselves for that matter. That doesn't have to end in or orgasm. Which also opens the doors to a lot more communication. Because we're not just going towards this thing, which presumably we all know how to do, like intercourse, we're talking about pleasure. Well, there's lots of ways that we need to be able to talk to our partner about how we experience pleasure, what we like or don't like. It also opens doorways to exploration and experimentation. If we're not just going towards this one goal, we're really looking, it opens space for us to experiment, to explore with each other how we both experience pleasure. And this can be, again, with sexuality, bringing up sexuality as something that could be spiritual too. When our focus is on pleasure, it opens up that space to think about not just as the performance or the acts that we're doing, but how does our sexual intimacy increase our emotional intimacy together? How does it speak to our sense of who we are as a person? Or how we experience spirituality. So this is a really important thing that is a big shift, I think, in a lot of our thinking. So just to emphasize again, when we focus on pleasure, we give people tools to build self-esteem, independence, and empowerment through understanding their bodies. We set people up to expect pleasurable experiences, which also means we set them up to say something when they're experiencing something that's not pleasurable. We also teach that all sexual participants are going to be aware, actively participating, making collaborative decisions and sexual choices, and giving and receiving constant feedback. So it becomes about giving and receiving pleasure rather than just about getting to this end goal. That makes sense. So then how do we use it? So how we use that? As I said, sometimes I use it partially as a psychoeducational tool. There's a great TED Talk, actually, if you have not seen it, and I do not know how to pronounce the guy's last name. His first name's Al. But if you go into YouTube and Google sex metaphor TED Talk, it should come up pretty quickly. And he talks about how sex, in our culture, sex really is in desperate need of a new metaphor, because our current metaphor is baseball, which, if you think about it, is very progressive. There are certain ways that you run around the bases, right? And you're supposed to run around all of the bases in order to score. This is about two adversarial teams playing against each other, right? There's all sorts of ways that baseball is a really problematic metaphor for sex.
Getting a home run.
Right, exactly. He run, but you only got the first base, he struck out. I mean, there's all different ways that we use baseball as a metaphor. So he suggests ordering pizza as being a new metaphor. And so the reason why he does that is he says that it's really about, first of all, it's this round thing. There's no like one place that you start. There's no like one place that you end. Also, there's a lot of communication and negotiation that has to happen about what goes on the pizza. So sometimes there's some give and take. You know, you can have some pepperoni, if I can have my olives over here. And the people are working together collaboratively as a team rather than as adversaries. So it could be a really good conversation starter with some of your clients. Also to help them start exploring, like, how is it that they thought about sex? Because this is so common to think about sex as performance that oftentimes it's not examined at all. It's like, well, this is just how you think about it. So it opens up that space for them to start exploring it in a different way. It also, I use this pleasure versus performance as a way to help clients start communicating together about what they, how they experience pleasure. Now, even in here, like, people are like, pleasure? What's that? We never talked about pleasure. We don't want to tell the middle schoolers and high schoolers about pleasure. God help us. So oftentimes I'll have them start with talking about how they experience non-sexual pleasure. What are just ways you experience pleasure? There's a sex therapist named Esther Perel. If you haven't heard of her, she has a great book called Mating in Captivity, which I think is a great critique of dominant American culture around sexuality. It can be really helpful for clients, but also just for me, kind of thinking about how you think about sex. Full disclosure, I think it's a great cultural critique. I don't necessarily agree with her therapeutic conclusions, but you can come to your own decision about that. But she has a discussion about how she says dominant American culture tends to be deeply suspicious of pleasure. We tend to think of pleasure as something that's maybe lazy, certainly self-indulgent, something to be suspect, whereas we like to think of ourselves as very, very busy and productive, which is oftentimes the opposite of what it takes to really experience pleasure. And so I'll have clients explore both together and individually what are even non-sexual ways that they experience pleasure. Is it taking a hot bath? Is it going for a long bike ride? Is it eating a good meal? What are ways that they experience pleasure, and how do they experience pleasure in their body? What does that feel like for them? So having clients explore pleasure on their own, and then we'll move into more sexual pleasure. And then I also will work with clients to set up pleasure dates. A typical sex therapy intervention is called Sensate Focus, which again could be its own presentation. So suffice to say, it's a progressive series of activities that are non-pressure, non-performance based, so that couples can explore how they experience pleasure together, especially touch, without worrying about it like, oh, this is going to have to end in intercourse. So we'll set up those pleasure dates that they do on their own, and then they come back in and we'll process it with them and talk about it. But it's amazing the things that come up when you start talking about pleasure. Sometimes people are like, whoa, I don't have time for pleasure. I got a PCA, I got to work, I got, all of these things going on. So any thoughts or questions about any of this?
I have a quick question. I generally recommend a client see their PCP, their primary care, when there's symptoms that are potentially medically based, and have them request a full blood workup.
Right.
I heard you mention neurologist. Should that?
Generally speaking, if they're coming in with, male coming in specifically with maybe some function questions, I usually refer specifically to a neurologist. For women, I have a few OBGYNs who really specialize, especially in hormonal care, or pelvic pain is something I work with a lot, that I send to specifically, just because I think sometimes a GP or a PCP, they aren't necessary. They have a lot of things, and if it's something really specific, they may not always catch it. So even if they've had some work done, like by their PCP, if what I'm hearing is kind of saying, like, it sounds like there might be a medical basis here, I might send them to a neurologist as well.
find it ironic that we're a society that overindulges in all kinds of things, including food. Low income pleasure for our own selves, we quite often underindulge, but when we do indulge, we often take it to extents. which-
Right, well, I think, I mean, I might argue that when we overindulge, we're not doing it for the sake of pleasure. We're often doing it for the sake of escape, avoiding, dealing with problematic
Pain.
things. Yeah, dealing with our pain. Instead of really being able to, enjoy a really good meal as something that's a pleasure, not as something that's missing. Or, any other things.
I have to ask this question before you finish, and it may or may not be relevant.
Okay.
There was a thing on the news yesterday about 50 Shades of Grey.
Mm-hmm.
And it said that they had pre-sales for tickets. 8 or 10 states that had the highest number
Right.
of sales were Southern Baptist Bible states. And that Mississippi, where they're calling on for all kinds of, Alabama, where they're fighting all kinds of laws around sex, that was the state that had the most people attending, who planned to attend. The first 3 showings in that particular city in Alabama were sold out. What's the commentary there? You have to run into that in your practice. Is it puritanical? Are we not getting this? So we got to find it somewhere else.
That's a big piece of it. I think that especially because female sexuality, and we have a big discussion about this issue is great in general. But it ought to be fun. My guess would be that yes, in these circumstances, it probably does have to do with having a very repressed and rigid expectation around what sex can and can't be, and then having this movie that kind of open book originally that kind of opens up other possibilities. I think probably does happen into a wanting to explore and kind of widen their experience around sexuality. That would be my guess.
And then go to the movie and just get it all screwed up.
I mean, there's a lot of things we could say about 50 Shades. I think that one of the great things it has done is allowed some focus on pleasure and exploring sexuality in a different way.
There's a lot on that side.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly critique the book for, it's essentially a Disney movie on steroids, right? It's like you got the virginal princess, as they get, I don't ask you who's read the book. You probably heard something about it, I'm sure. And she meets her Prince Charming, who is of course a billionaire, who is also very sexually confident, self-confident and aware, and so just wants to give her pleasure, which then allows her to just focus on her own pleasure without having to take care of him. There's a whole dominance and submission piece of it, the BDSM, the bondage piece of it as well. And there's a lot, that we could look at and say, this is the meaning towards women's sexuality, certainly. There are some people who would argue that ultimately she's the one that saves him, especially emotionally. But regardless of how you look at it, it has been a phenomenon that's allowed women to start maybe exploring their sexuality in a different way. For those of you who are interested, there was actually a great article in Entertainment Weekly of all places that was written by a Vanity Fair writer about the critique of women's sexuality and what 50 Shades of Grey says or doesn't say about female sexuality in general, especially in the context of her argument is that we don't know what female sexuality is outside of the context of patriarchy. And so over millennial, female sexuality and submission being sexualized over time. So is it really that women like the submissive role, or that there's something inherent about that to female sexuality? We simply don't know, because we don't know a context of female sexuality outside of this paradigm of male dominance.
So that brings up a question for me. Certainly that's a very American culture.
Right.
But there are countries that are not as patriarchal. Do we have some not my area of expertise, but I want to say Samoa.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if there's like some research or literature around, you know, some of these other cultures that have sort of a different social structure.
Right.
And if there are some substantial differences in sexual norms.
And I think, you know, certainly in some of the cultures I've heard of that do have, you know, some different norms, yes, there is substantial difference in how female sexuality, for example, is expressed. I don't know specific studies that look at things like dominance and submission, so I'd want to look into that. But certainly, I mean, there's, you know, there's communities in Cambodia. There was a recent documentary, maybe not so recent, that was looking at how young girls, like they are the ones that choose who it is as teenagers, who they're going to explore their sexuality with. It's very open, it's expected. There's pretty much zero sexual exploitation or assault. You know, the young men know and respect that this is the young women's right to choose who it is that they're going to invite, and they of course can say yes or no as well. But it's a very different kind of paradigm than what we see in more in the Western cultures. So yes, there is a difference, but I don't know in terms of that dominance issue.
And I wasn't thinking specifically along those lines, I was thinking more like, is it just purely a 180-degree role reversal of stereotypical roles in Western culture, or is it, like you said, sort of a paradigm shift where it really is quite different?
It's just very different. Yeah, I mean, that would be my guess in what I've seen. So I know that we're pretty much out of time, so just real quickly.
Sorry, wait, I have
Yes.
one quick question on the pleasure date thing. When you assign that to couples, who assigns that? And I get the question of, so are we not allowed to have sex if that's where it leads? And I never quite know how to answer that.
So the way I do it, I mean, traditional same-day focus is they actually take intercourse off the table for a set period of time.
Okay.
What I find is that that's not always super realistic for a lot of couples. And so the way I do it is I say, if you want to have sex, but when you are doing this exercise, it's not doing this exercise. And that doesn't mean we do this exercise, wait 15 minutes, and then do sex. We do this exercise, and sex does not happen that day, essentially. Okay.
And it's not with another therapist, it's on their own.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so when to refer out. So generally speaking, you know, when I talk to therapists who don't necessarily specialize in sex therapy, if at all possible, I actually prefer you don't refer out. Especially when it comes to sexuality, because of all the shame base that can be there. Oftentimes what happens is if you say, well, like, I can't see you for this, then they get the message, I am so screwed up that you can help me. Now, that may be different for you all if you have just a set number of therapy sessions, because you can talk to them about, like, I have 5 sessions with you. This is something that's going to take more time, and so that's why I want to refer you out. And I think that that's appropriate. But if you have the time with clients, if you are willing and open to learning, to consulting with a sex therapist, and working within the client's values around sexuality, then I encourage you to actually see the clients, just as long as you're willing to give that education and consult.
One thing I do when I'm referring out to specialists to try to help decrease some of the stigma that we're talking about is to make a medical analogy of, you know, as an EAP clinician,
Right.
You know, partly we're working with implementation as well, but also I'm a generalist.
Right.
I know a little bit about a lot of different things. And sure, I can probably do some basics here, but much like if you went to your primary care provider and you had, you know, maybe you have some very simple high blood pressure, maybe they'll prescribe a medication and just watch it. But if you know, if they're worried a little bit about this, or maybe there's a couple of variables involved in it, they're probably going to refer you to a cardiologist, simply to get somebody who has more expertise and specialization. And my clients usually seem to be fairly receptive and understanding that. I sort of try to frame it in terms of you know, it's not that you're so disordered that you need more than I can provide, but more like, you know, gosh, we got all this expertise over here, wouldn't you want like the best service you can get instead of like, yeah, I don't know about this.
Which I agree, and in my experience, sometimes clients, no matter how you try to touch it, because it's about sex, it becomes, oh God, this is everything. I'm really screwed up. And I think that we as clinicians probably, I trust that you all do try to couch it, in the best way possible. Just be aware, because it's about sex, because there's so much shame and secretness involved, they still may take it as something. And so even giving them the choice, if they feel really, really comfortable with you and you do have the capacity to see them for longer, it might do them more good, even if you're kind of learning along with them. If you have before, that is them. So take it for what it's worth. I think there's good arguments for either way. So hopefully we did a lot of discussion during the presentation. I'll be here for a little bit if you have specific questions that come up. I want to thank you all for just your participation and your discussions. There are some resources on the next slide, which is just a very beginning resource list, but it's a good place to start, whether for clients or just for your own knowledge. And then my contact information is on the last slide.
Thank you.